Sarah Chen's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her heart racing as she crafted yet another response to the mysterious anon entrepreneur who had captured her attention for the past 6 months. The soft glow of her laptop screen illuminated her small studio apartment, where she spent her precious hours between hospital shifts, exchanging messages with someone who seemed to understand her soul perfectly. The autumn rain tapped gently against her window, creating a soothing rhythm that matched her typing. Outside, the city lights blurred through the raindrops, creating a dreamy atmosphere that matched her current state of mind. She was falling in love with someone she had never seen, and somehow that made perfect sense in today's digital age. Their story had begun in an unlikely place, an online forum for young entrepreneurs seeking mentorship and guidance. While others shared business plans and market analyses, Sarah and her anonymous friend had discovered a deeper connection in the comments section of a post about maintaining work-life balance. "Sometimes I feel like I'm wearing a mask," he had written in that first message. "Everyone sees what they expect to see, but nobody knows the real me." Those words had resonated with Sarah, who spent her days as a dedicated nephrology resident, hiding her dreams of opening her own wellness clinic behind a facade of quiet efficiency. Their initial exchange had blossomed into private messages, then daily conversations that stretched long into the night. They shared their fears, their hopes, their darkest thoughts, and their wildest dreams. He told her about his pressure to succeed in his family's business, though he never specified what that business was. She confided in him about the challenges of being a first-generation American, trying to balance her parents' sacrifices with her own aspirations. What made their connection unique was their mutual decision to remain faceless to each other. In an era of instant gratification and quick judgments based on profile pictures, they had chosen to know each other's souls first. Sarah had her reasons. Years of dealing with subtle discrimination and preconceptions about her appearance had made her wary of being judged too quickly. Her anonymous friend claimed he wanted to be valued for his thoughts rather than his status or looks. Their conversations ranged from philosophical discussions about the meaning of success to playful debates about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He would send her music recommendations at midnight, classical pieces that reminded him of her intellectual depth, jazz songs that matched her described personality. She would respond with poems she had written in medical school, verses about healing bodies and mending spirits that she had never shown anyone else. On particularly difficult days at the hospital, when Sarah lost patience or faced the harsh realities of the healthcare system, his messages became her sanctuary. He seemed to know exactly what to say, whether it was a simple, "I believe in you," or a lengthy analysis of why the medical system needed passionate doctors like her. They had developed their own language of inside jokes and references. She called him Mr. Mystery, and he called her Doc Poet. They had created a virtual world where background, appearance, and social status didn't matter, a pure connection of minds and hearts. Sarah's colleagues at the hospital noticed the change in her. She walked with a new lightness in her step, smiled more easily during challenging shifts, and handled stress with a newfound grace. Her best friend and fellow resident Lisa teased her about her invisible boyfriend, but Sarah didn't mind. She knew what she had was special, even if it defied conventional relationship norms. Tonight was different, though. After 6 months of this beautiful anonymity, he had finally suggested meeting in person. The message sat heavy in her inbox. "I think it's time we see who we've been talking to all these months. What do you say, Doc Poet? Ready to make this real?" Sarah's hands trembled as she typed her response. Part of her wanted to preserve the perfect bubble they had created, where prejudices and preconceptions couldn't touch them. But a larger part yearned to see the face behind the words that had become so precious to her. The cursor blinked expectantly as she wrote, "Yes, I think it's time." but promise me something. Promise that whatever we see won't change what we've built here." His response came almost immediately. "Nothing could change how I feel about you. You've seen the real me. Everything else is just packaging." Little did Sarah know that those words, so beautiful in the safety of her apartment, would soon be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. As she began planning their first meeting, the real world waited to intrude on their digital fairy tale, bringing with it all the complexities and prejudices they had so carefully avoided. In their online sanctuary, the rain continued its gentle percussion against her window, nature's own soundtrack to this pivotal moment in her life. Sarah took a deep breath and began to think about where they should meet, unaware that her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would test not just their connection, but their very understanding of love, prejudice, and redemption. The man behind the messages. Alexander Sterling III stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, watching the city below as if it were his personal chessboard. At 32 stories up, everyone looked the same, tiny figures moving in predictable patterns, just the way he liked it, ordered, controlled, segregated into their proper places. His reflection in the glass showed what magazines had dubbed corporate America's most eligible bachelor: sharp jawline, steel blue eyes, and perfectly styled dark hair that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The Armani suit he wore was one of 50, all in varying shades of grey and black, all perfectly tailored to his athletic frame. "Mr. Sterling, your father is on line 1. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Alexander's jaw tightened. These calls always meant the same thing: another lecture about upholding the Sterling legacy. He picked up the phone, bracing himself. "Alexander." His father's voice was as cold as ever. "The board meeting is in an hour. I trust you've prepared the presentation on our new development project?" "Yes, father. Everything's ready." He glanced at the presentation on his laptop, knowing every word by heart. What he wouldn't tell his father was that he'd spent most of the night talking to his online friend instead of doing the final review. "And the charity gala tonight? You'll be there?" Of course. Another chance for his father to parade him in front of potential investors' daughters, all carefully selected from what his father called our kind of people. After hanging up, Alexander turned to his laptop, where a chat window remained minimized. Here he wasn't Alexander Sterling III, heir to Sterling Developments and the city's largest fortune. Here he was just Alex, sharing his thoughts with someone who didn't judge him by his bank account or family name. What would she think if she knew the truth? That the man she'd been confiding in was the same one whose company was currently displacing hundreds of families for luxury developments. That his family's old money came with old prejudices he'd been raised to maintain. He opened their chat history, reading through her latest message about a difficult surgery she'd performed. Her compassion shone through every word. In their digital world, he could pretend he deserved someone like her. He could pretend he wasn't bound by generations of carefully maintained racial purity that his father prized above all else. A date with destiny. The Wellington Hotel stood like a golden sentinel in the heart of the city, its Art Deco facade gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Alexander adjusted his tie for the 100th time as he walked through the revolving doors. For once, he hadn't sent his assistant to scout the location first. He wanted everything about this meeting to be real. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. "Mr. Sterling, your usual table?" "No," Alexander replied, surprising himself. "Table 23 by the window." He wanted a more private spot for this meeting, away from the usual power dining section where business deals were made over overpriced wines. As he waited, he rehearsed what he would say. Should he reveal his identity immediately, or let the conversation flow naturally first? He'd chosen not to make a reservation under his name, wanting to preserve the anonymity for just a little longer. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clink of fine china. Every few minutes the door would open and Alexander's heart would jump. Would this be her? He'd broken his own rule about staying detached, about keeping relationships purely strategic. For the first time in his life, he felt genuine nervousness. A text message lit up his phone. "I'm here." Blue dress, near the entrance. Alexander stood, tugging his jacket straight. As he turned toward the entrance, time seemed to slow down. Through the elegant archway, he saw her. Petite figure, graceful posture, and striking features that immediately betrayed her Asian heritage. His world stopped. Everything he'd been raised to believe, every careful lesson about maintaining the Sterling bloodline, every snide comment his father had made about those people, crashed into the genuine connection he'd built over the past 6 months. She hadn't seen him yet. She was looking down at her phone, probably sending another message. In that moment, Alexander Sterling III, who had every material possession a man could want, faced the first real choice of his life. Would he be the man his father had raised him to be, or the person he'd become in those late-night conversations? His feet felt like lead as he took a step forward. The waiter was already approaching her with a warm smile. "Table for 2, miss?" "Yes, I'm meeting someone." Her voice was exactly as he'd imagined it, gentle but confident. Alexander's hand gripped the back of his chair until his knuckles turned white. In the next few seconds, he would either become the man he wanted to be or remain the person he'd been raised to be. She looked up, eyes scanning the restaurant, and their gazes met. The cruelest rejection. In the golden light of the Wellington Hotel's dining room, Sarah's smile began to fade. She recognized the shift in Alexander's expression. She'd seen it countless times before, but never with this much visceral disgust, never with this much betrayal. The warmth in his eyes crystallized into something cold and hard, like frost forming on a window pane. Alexander's internal struggle played across his face for just a moment, before his features settled into a mask of aristocratic disdain. The transformation was complete. From the vulnerable man she'd known online to this towering figure of privilege and prejudice. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Around them, other diners continued their meals, unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the fine tablecloths, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. "Wrong?" Alexander's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Several heads turned their way. "I'd say something is very wrong indeed. What kind of game are you playing?" Sarah's hands began to tremble beneath the table. "Game? I don't understand. I'm Sarah. We've been talking for... I know exactly who you've been pretending to be." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Did you think this was funny? Catfishing a Sterling? Was this some elaborate plan to get close to my family's money?" The blood drained from Sarah's face. "Sterling? You're Alexander Sterling III. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd read about the Sterling family in the news, seen their names attached to controversial development projects that had displaced entire immigrant communities, including her own cousin's family last year. "And you're..." He gestured dismissively at her, as if words to describe her weren't worth the effort. "This is precisely why I never should have deviated from proper channels for meeting potential associates." A waiter approached with menus, sensing the tension but bound by professional duty. "Would Sir and Madam like to start with some wine this evening?" Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "There won't be any wine, there won't be anything. I'm leaving." He turned to Sarah, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. I suggest you do the same. Go back to whatever part of town you came from." Sarah sat frozen, dignity keeping her spine straight, even as her world crumbled around her. 6 months of late-night conversations, shared dreams, and emotional intimacy shattered like fine china dropped on marble floors. "Sir," the waiter interjected nervously, "shall I add this to your regular account?" "Account?" Alexander's laugh was cruel. "I'm not paying for anything I didn't order, and I certainly won't be responsible for this situation." He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit she'd learned about during one of their many conversations about anxious gestures. The intimacy of knowing this detail now felt like a knife twisting in her chest. As Alexander stormed toward the exit, his footsteps echoing on the parquet flooring, whispers rippled through the restaurant like wind through wheat. Sarah sat paralyzed, watching months of genuine connection dissolve into nothing more than prejudice and pride. The waiter hovered uncertainly. "Miss, will you be staying for dinner?" Reality crashed back like a wave. Sarah's purse contained exactly $23, enough for her bus fare home and maybe a coffee tomorrow. She'd thought. The humiliation burned hotter than any fever she'd treated in the ER. "The bill," the waiter continued apologetically, placing a leather folder beside her water glass. "For the table reservation and setup. It's hotel policy." Sarah opened the folder and felt her stomach drop. The reservation fee alone was more than she made in 2 days at the hospital. Around her, she could feel eyes watching, judging, pitying. The same eyes she'd felt throughout medical school, throughout her residency, eyes that questioned whether she belonged. But it was different this time. This wasn't about her credentials or her capabilities. This was about her heart, which lay shattered somewhere between the carefully pressed tablecloth and the pristine silverware she'd never gotten to use. She began, her voice catching. "I don't—" A shadow fell across the table. An elderly gentleman from a nearby table stood there, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Allow me, my dear, and might I say, you've had a lucky escape. I've known the Sterlings for 3 generations, the money never made up for the meanness in their souls." As the man handled the bill, Sarah gathered the shreds of her dignity around her like a shield. She'd survived worse than this, she told herself. She'd survived medical school, 30-hour shifts, losing patients. She would survive this too. But as she stepped out into the evening air, the weight of Alexander's words pressed down on her like lead. The man she'd shared her deepest thoughts with, who had seemed to understand her soul so completely, had been nothing but a carefully constructed illusion. Or perhaps worse, he had been real, but his prejudices were stronger than any connection they'd formed. She walked to the bus stop, her expensive dress now feeling like a costume she'd been foolish to buy. Above her, the windows of the Wellington Hotel gleamed like judging eyes, and somewhere in the city, Alexander Sterling III was probably already forgetting about the woman he'd deemed unworthy of even a goodbye. Fate's twisted hand. The emergency room at Metropolitan General Hospital never slept. At 3 a.m., under harsh fluorescent lights, Sarah moved through the controlled chaos with practiced efficiency. 6 months had passed since the Wellington Hotel incident, and she'd thrown herself into her work with renewed intensity, finding solace in the one place where actions mattered more than appearances. "Dr. Chen," a nurse's urgent voice cut through the ambient noise of beeping monitors and rolling gurneys. Multiple traumas coming in, high-speed collision on Sterling Boulevard. Sarah allowed herself a bitter smile at the irony of the street name as she pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. The emergency bay doors burst open, bringing with them the controlled frenzy of paramedics and the metallic scent of blood. Male, mid-30s, unconscious, severe trauma to the abdominal region, the first responder rattled off. BP dropping, possible internal bleeding. Sarah's world stopped. There, on the stretcher, lay Alexander Sterling III. His perfectly tailored suit was now shredded and blood-soaked, his commanding presence reduced to a pale, unconscious form under the harsh hospital lights. The arrogant face that had sneered at her was now slack, vulnerable, human. "Dr. Chen?" The nurse's voice seemed to come from far away. "Do you want me to call Doctor Patterson for this one?" For a fraction of a second, Sarah remembered the humiliation, the cruel words, the degradation. Then her medical training kicked in, pushing everything else aside. "Number, I'll take him." The next hours were a blur of activity. Initial assessment revealed severe kidney trauma from the impact. His blood work showed signs of underlying kidney disease, something he'd apparently been hiding from the public. As Sarah worked, she couldn't help but notice the empty emergency contact fields in his chart. No family listed, no friends. The great Alexander Sterling III was, in this moment, utterly alone. "Cross-match for type and prepare for possible transfusion," she ordered, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. As she worked, memories of their online conversations flooded back. His loneliness, his fears of never being truly known, his struggle with family expectations. It had all been real, she realized, just as real as his prejudices. Dawn was breaking when the preliminary tests came back. Sarah stared at the results, double-checking the numbers that would change everything. Both of Sterling's kidneys were failing, not just from the accident, but from a congenital condition that had been quietly destroying them for years. Without immediate intervention, the mighty Sterling empire would soon be looking for a new heir. "Page nephrology," she instructed a nurse, even though, as the resident nephrologist on call, she was effectively paging herself. "And get me his full medical history. There's something he's not telling us." As she studied his unconscious form, Sarah remembered his words about masks and pretenses from their very first online conversation. How many layers of deception had he wrapped himself in? How long had he known about his condition? The answer came an hour later in the form of Dr. Williams, head of nephrology at Sterling Memorial Hospital, a facility funded by Alexander's family. "He's been on the transplant list for 8 months, Dr. Williams revealed reluctantly. Privately, of course. The family insisted on complete discretion. 8 months. Their entire online relationship had occurred while he was secretly dying, searching for a matching donor that his money couldn't simply buy. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had judged her so harshly for her ethnicity now lay vulnerable in her hospital, his life hanging by a thread. A nurse appeared with more test results. "Dr. Chen, you asked for the full compatibility workup." Sarah took the papers, already knowing what she would find. She had run her own compatibility tests months ago, a standard procedure for nephrology residents studying different tissue types. The results hadn't meant anything then. They meant everything now. "Dr. Chen?" Dr. Williams interrupted her thoughts. "The Sterling family's private medical team is on their way. They'll want to transfer him to their facility." Sarah looked at the test results in her hands, then at the unconscious figure who had once meant so much to her. In a few hours, he would wake up and probably demand a different doctor. He would look at her with that same disgust, even as his body betrayed him. But right now, in this moment, she held something no amount of Sterling money could buy, a perfect tissue match and the power to decide what to do with that information. "Call his family," she said finally, her voice firm. "Tell them we need to talk about their son's options. All of them." The sun was fully up now, painting the hospital room in shades of gold, reminiscent of that fateful evening at the Wellington. Outside the window, the city was waking up, unaware that in this sterile room, fate was about to teach a powerful lesson about humanity, prejudice, and the true meaning of healing. A life in the balance. The Sterling family arrived like royalty, their designer shoes clicking against the hospital's linoleum floors. Alexander Sterling II, every bit as imposing as his society page photo suggested, strode into the conference room as if he owned it, which, given his family's donations to the hospital, he practically did. Dr. Chen. He tested her name like it was something foreign on his tongue. "I understand you're handling my son's case." Sarah sat straight-backed in her chair, medical files arranged precisely before her. 6 years of medical training and 2 years of residency had prepared her for difficult conversations. None had prepared her for this. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, your son's condition is critical. The accident severely damaged his already compromised kidneys. Without an immediate transplant, he has perhaps 72 hours. She kept her voice clinical, professional, despite the weight of what she knew. 72 hours. Mrs. Sterling's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. "But surely we can expedite the list. Money is no object." Sarah took a deep breath. "Even with your resources, finding a match in time would be nearly impossible. The compatibility requirements are extremely specific." "Then we'll buy a kidney," Alexander's father stated flatly. "There are places—" "That would be illegal, Mr. Sterling," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. "And more importantly, it would likely kill your son. He needs a specific tissue match due to his rare blood type and antibody profile." The elder Sterling's face reddened. "Now you listen here. No, you listen." Sarah's calm tone cut through his bluster. "Your son is dying. Right now in this hospital there is exactly one viable donor match." She slid her own medical results across the table. "Me." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Sterling's eyes widened in recognition. Someone had obviously told her about the Wellington Hotel incident. Mr. Sterling's face went through a remarkable series of colors. "This is preposterous," he finally sputtered. "We'll transfer him to Sterling Memorial." "He won't survive the transfer," Sarah stated flatly, "and you know it." Through the conference room's windows, they could see into Alexander's ICU room, where machines kept him alive. He looked small in the hospital bed, all his carefully constructed walls stripped away by illness and injury. "Why?" Mrs. Sterling's question was barely a whisper. "After how he treated you." Sarah stood, gathering her files. "Because I took an oath to heal. Because your son's life matters more than his prejudices, or yours." She moved toward the door, then turned back. "And because 6 months ago I got to know the real Alexander Sterling, the one who hides behind his family's expectations, the one who wants to be better than this." She placed the consent forms on the table. "I'll give you an hour to decide, but understand this: I'm not doing this for your approval, your money, or your gratitude. I'm doing it because it's right, and because somewhere under all those layers of prejudice is a man worth saving." As she walked out, she heard Mrs. Sterling begin to cry. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Word spread through the hospital like wildfire. The Asian doctor giving her kidney to the racist billionaire who had humiliated her. Sarah ignored the whispers, focused on the medicine, on the surgery to come. In pre-op, she asked for 5 minutes alone with her patient. Alexander lay unconscious, unaware of the drama unfolding around him, unaware that his life now literally depended on accepting a part of someone he had deemed unworthy. "You once told me that everyone wears masks," she said softly to his unconscious form. "That no one knows the real you. Well, tomorrow you'll wake up with a piece of me inside you. No more masks, Alexander. It's time to decide who you really are." The surgical team waited respectfully as she finished her private moment. As they wheeled her toward the operating room, she caught a glimpse of the elder Sterlings watching from behind a glass partition, their proud faces strained with an emotion that looked almost like shame. "Ready, Doctor?" "Chen." the anesthesiologist asked, positioning the mask. Sarah thought of all the meanings of the word ready. Ready to risk her life, ready to save her former tormentor, ready to prove that love and compassion could transcend prejudice. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm ready." As the anesthesia took hold, her last thought was of their first online conversation when they had both been nothing more than words on a screen, souls connecting across the digital void. Tomorrow, they would be connected in a way far more profound than either of them could have imagined. The overhead lights began to fade, and with them, the last barriers between two worlds that had never been meant to meet. The ultimate sacrifice recovery was a journey they walked together, quite literally, as Alexander insisted his rehabilitation bed remain next to Sarah's in the hospital's VIP wing. The complications from her surgery had been severe, a rare hemorrhage that had nearly taken her life during the procedure. For 3 weeks they healed side by side, their medical charts telling a story of two bodies learning to live with new realities. "Why did you do it?" he asked her one quiet evening, when the city lights twinkled beyond their window like earthbound stars. "You knew the risks were higher for you because of your size. You could have let me die, and no one would have blamed you." Sarah turned her head to look at him, her face still pale but her eyes bright. "Because hate is easy, Alexander. Love, real love, is choosing to see the best in someone, even when they're showing you their worst. Love's true face, a wedding to remember." 6 months later, the Sterling estate gardens bloomed with cherry blossoms, a specially arranged tribute to Sarah's heritage. The wedding that made headlines across the country wasn't just a union of two people, it was a symbol of transformation. Alexander stood at the altar, no longer the arrogant man who had stormed out of the Wellington Hotel. The scar on his side, matching the one Sarah carried, was a permanent reminder of how she had literally given a piece of herself to save him. When Sarah walked down the aisle, she wore a dress that blended Western elegance with traditional Chinese elements, a design that celebrated both their cultures. But more striking than her dress was her radiant smile, one that spoke of triumph over prejudice, of love over hate. "Before I met Sarah," Alexander's voice rang out during his vows, "I was half the man I am today, and not just because I'm literally carrying a piece of her with me." Gentle laughter rippled through the gathered guests. "She taught me that true strength isn't in maintaining walls between people, but in having the courage to tear them down. She didn't just save my life, she saved my soul." Sarah's vows were equally moving. Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth fighting for, even when they're fighting themselves. "You taught me that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the hardest hearts sometimes need the most healing." The Sterling family fortune, once used to divide communities, was now being redirected. Together, Alexander and Sarah established the Chen Sterling Foundation, dedicated to providing medical care to underserved communities and promoting cross-cultural understanding. Life's greatest lesson. The story of Alexander and Sarah teaches us that love isn't just an emotion, it's a choice we make every day. Their journey reveals several profound truths. 1. True transformation comes from within. Alexander's change wasn't just because Sarah saved his life. It came from recognizing his own prejudices and choosing to be better. 2. Forgiveness has healing power. Sarah's decision to forgive didn't just heal Alexander's body. It healed generations of ingrained prejudice. 3. Love sees beyond surface. Their initial online connection proved that when we remove our preconceptions, we can connect with the soul rather than the surface. 4. Sacrifice can bridge any divide. Sarah's willingness to risk her life showed that true love means putting someone else's needs above your own prejudices. 5. Change ripples outward. Their story didn't just change them, it transformed their families, their community, and inspired others to examine their own biases. 6. Heritage should unite, not divide. Their wedding celebration showed how different cultures can complement and enrich each other rather than conflict. 7. Every soul deserves love. Despite Alexander's initial cruelty, he wasn't beyond redemption, proving that everyone deserves the chance to become better. Today, the Chen Sterling Medical Center stands as a testament to their journey. In the hospital's main lobby, a plaque reads, "Love sees with the heart, not with the eyes. It judges by actions, not appearances. And when it truly heals, it heals completely." Each year on their anniversary, Alexander and Sarah visit the same hotel where they first met in person. But now, instead of sitting at separate tables, they sit together, their joined hands resting on the same tablecloth where pride once divided them. Their matching scars have faded, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding the perfect person, but about helping someone become their best self. And in the end, that's the greatest lesson of all, that love, when it's real and pure and brave enough to face prejudice, doesn't just change two people, it changes the world. Please subscribe us if you liked our efforts.